Hello. Welcome everybody to our hybrid event, and apologize for the mistake on that first slide. We're doing this virtual via Team, not Zoom. Let me give our podium to Dr. Mike Dietrich to welcome everyone.
Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Wright School of Business here at Dalton State College. And we're all glad you're here. I don't know what all I should say. I guess I should put in a couple words for the college. We've got about 4,500 students and 20-some bachelor's degrees and 800 students in the School of Business. We've got 8 different baccalaureate degrees, pretty much the basics. We've got logistics and supply chain, management, accounting, management information systems, marketing, and finance and applied economics. So we hope you all think of us when you're sending your children or so on to college here. We have a supreme value here. I also need to say we're AACSB accredited, which is the top business accreditation in the field. So we share that with the very finest institutions. So we're proud of all that we're doing here. And with that, I would turn it back over to Lulu Copeland, and this should be a terrific presentation.
Thank you, Bob. So thank you to Dalton State for being our venue host. Thank you to Chattanooga Research Center, Georgia Tech Center for International Business Education and Research, and Greater Dalton Chamber for promoting today's event. I also want to thank US-China Business Council for presenting the annual reports to our audience today. But before I introduce our speaker, let me say a few things about Tennessee-China Network. Tennessee-China Network was founded in 2015. I am Lulu Copeland, the Executive Director. I was also the first chair of the Tennessee-China Network Board. We serve our members and potential members by creating a network to support organizations to connect and learn. The organization mainly functions in Tennessee, but we also support neighboring states like Georgia, Alabama, Kentucky, as well as other states not bordering Tennessee. I often partner with other organizations to provide needed resources. Corporate members So we have corporate members. You'll see the drink bucket over there are products from Double Cola, which is located in Chattanooga. And we also have, but I want to introduce a few members from Georgia, and I don't see Winnie, maybe she's late. So CFL Flooring is actually in Adairsville, and I have supported that company with some talent projects. And we also have Jumpstart here. Kelly is back there with the recruiting company. And I also want to report that we have Catherine, oh there, she traveled here from Atlanta, and she just joined as a sponsor for the Tennessee-China Network. We serve cities, chambers, education institutions, and individuals, basically trying to provide resources as needed. When we do the networking, please meet them and find out how we can support each other. But let me not delay our program today. I want to introduce Elizabeth Rowland. She's the Director of Subnational Initiative with US-China Business Council. And she was also the founder of Tennessee-China Network. And I'll let Elizabeth start the program.
All right. Thank you for that introduction, Lulu. And thank you to Tennessee China Network, Dalton State College, the Georgia Tech Center for International Business Education and Research, as well as the China Research Center for co-hosting this event with us. Let me first introduce US-China Business Council, which is where I work. As Lulu mentioned, I'm a director of subnational initiatives. I'm based out of Knoxville, Tennessee. And US-China Business Council is a nonprofit trade association that is also nonpartisan, and it represents more than 260 American companies that do business in China. Our membership includes large corporations and SMEs, or small and medium-sized enterprises, from nearly every industry. And our chief goal is to foster a strong, fair, and reciprocal trade relationship with China by acting as a bridge between both of the governments. Each year, as part of that effort, we track US exports to China by state and by congressional district. And we also track the number of jobs that are created through those exports. We do this in order to provide a more in-depth, data-driven look at the US-China trade relationship. I should make a quick note that when I'm talking about exports, for goods, those are exports from 2021, last year. On services, I'm referring to exports from 2020. And the reason that is because the data comes out from the government at different times. And we only get the services data a little bit behind the goods data. And it takes time to curate it in order to prepare it for the report. So that is why there's a difference in the years. In this event, I'll start out by going over the report, and then my colleague, David Thomas, Senior Vice President at USCBC, will join me virtually for the Q&A. So let's dive right in. So the top line story is that goods exports to China grew in 2021, and they grew by 21%. It's a really good growth rate. This is actually an all-time high, above the pre-tariff levels and above pre-pandemic levels. This can be partially attributed to China's lifting of some of the tariffs for the phase 1 trade agreement. And this growth was on top of 2020's figure. So in 2020, there was a lot of goods export growth as well. So we have really good trends on the goods side. Services, not so much. You can see here that service exports to China dropped in 2020, 33%. That is obviously because of the pandemic. Services includes a lot of things that you have to do person to person. For example, travel, education, and those really got impacted by the pandemic. The total jobs supported in 2020 was down 5% because the growth in exports wasn't able to counteract the decrease in services, and so you just had a little bit of a decline in the jobs supported. For goods exports specifically to China, you can see they grew to a record high of 149 billion. That is largely driven by agriculture. We've had big growth in oilseeds and grains, oilseeds primarily being soybeans. There was a growth of 4.8 billion, bringing it up to 21.9 billion worth of crops exported to China in 2021. Semiconductors was another big export growth area. Semiconductor sales grew by about 2.1 billion, and oil and gas grew by about 1.6 billion. Finally, pharmaceuticals, another area of growth. That one grew by 2 billion to a new high of 7.9 billion. And as I mentioned, the soybeans were really increased partly because of, or largely because of the Phase 1 agreement. Semiconductors, part of that is that China continues to need US produced semiconductors because they're very high quality. But another piece of it might be that they might have been stockpiling a little bit semiconductors in preparation for some potential sanctions that might be coming down the pike. On pharmaceuticals, it's a little bit hard to pinpoint, but there have been changes in China's regulatory process for drug approvals, so it might be partly as a result of that. But it's also often that the China market doesn't have a domestic equivalent for some pharmaceuticals, and so over time the innovation and demand leads to the increased exports of that area. This slide shows the different types of exports. The bigger the box is, the more exports that the US sends to China. So you can see the wide range here that we have had. It includes things from manufactured goods to high tech, oil and gas and ag. The bigger one over on the left, oilseeds and grains at 21.9, all the way down to electrical equipment and soap at below 2 billion. This map, it shows the distribution or the change in goods exports to China by congressional district. So what you're looking at, the lines on there are the divisions of the congressional districts, and the dark blue means that goods exports increased a lot. Red, dark red, means it decreased a lot. So you can tell that in the middle of the country, the heartland saw really strong ag exports. We also saw strong oil and gas in Texas and Louisiana, and some other areas not quite as strong. So now we'll talk a little bit more about services. The services exports, as I mentioned, contracted to China pretty dramatically, and that includes personal travel, personal tourism, business travel, and also healthcare travel. All of those saw declines in 2020. Personal travel declined by 90%, as did business travel. And healthcare related travel dropped 79%, so not quite as bad. Historically, travel and tourism is the #1 service export from the US to China, and that has changed this in 2020 because of the pandemic. So education services actually moved to the top spot at 11.6 billion. So it wasn't due to gains, though. It was that education also fell, as I mentioned, but because of the difference in percentages of falls, it ended up being the #1 export. So here's another breakdown of all the different kinds of services. Education is at 11.6 billion. We've got different kinds of intellectual property, royalties from industrial processes. We've got financial services. And there's also some logistics and ocean port services and things like that in there. So this one is the services, changes in services exports. Pretty clear here, we had a bad year with the pandemic, and everything is red because everything declined. And if you look at Nevada and Hawaii, which are dark red, they both declined 70% because they are very dependent on tourism. Now we'll look at the employment figures. So the US jobs supported by exports to China vary depending on what the different state or congressional district tends to export the most of. So you can see again here in the middle of the map, the ag states did well. Their increases in job exports were able to outweigh the job losses from services declining. And so in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, the Dakotas, you can see a lot of blue there with increase in jobs. Some places like that are dependent on aerospace products, like Washington's 2nd District or South Carolina's 6th District, they saw big red declines because of reduction in airplane sales. All right, now we'll look more closely at Georgia. Through 2021, you can see here we had a good recovery from the dip down in 2019 at the middle of the trade war. And we've increased exports up to 4.2 billion. Here we have the top goods exports for Georgia to China, as well as the goods export markets overall for Georgia. So you can see that China is actually the 2nd largest export market for Georgia. A lot of people might not realize that, but that's after Canada, 6.1 million for Canada and 4.2 billion exports to China. So it's a pretty interesting growth there. One big driver of that growth was the exports for motor vehicles. And this was a pretty interesting point. Back in 2019, exports of motor vehicles to China was only at 2.6 million. 2020, it went up to 663 million. And then by 2021, it's the top of the list here for goods exports to China at 1.3 billion. It's pretty impressive growth there. Meat products was another that really had some good growth. It grew from 236 million in 2020 to 328 million in 2021. Aerospace products grew slightly as well, from 250 million to 276 million. Georgia's services exports, just showing you here the consistent trend that's pretty consistent with the national trend, where services exports to China have continued to grow for many years, and then with the pandemic really dropped dramatically. Now, Georgia's services exports. China isn't quite as high on the services export market list. Georgia dropped from prior years where China was last year, or not last year, I guess this would have been 2019 for services. China was the 3rd top service market for Georgia exports of services, and now it is the 6th market. The top export categories mirror the national data pretty closely, with education being the top one during this pandemic at 252 million. But again, that's actually a 52 million decline from the year prior. The number 2 category is interesting because it's ocean freight and port services. That service didn't even show up on the top 5 in the year prior. We are assuming it's largely because of the Port of Savannah, which as of that year, according to Wall Street Journal, counted on China for more than 40% of its shipping volumes. And it's possible that some of that increase was related to them showing up on the number 2 when they weren't in the top 5 before. Could be partly the sign of the others actually decreasing more. But also it could be partly that the cost of shipping went up, and therefore impacting the value of the shipping services. Finally, my last slide is jobs supported by Georgia's exports to China. 21,000 jobs right here in Georgia and across the country. These are direct as well as indirect jobs. So sometimes the export would originate from Georgia, but it might create a job somewhere else. So this is jobs not only in Georgia, but all across the country. And you can see the dark blue is where the more jobs are created. So Georgia's 1st, 2nd, and 5th districts support more than 2,300 jobs each, the darker blue ones. And the 1st district being Atlanta, or actually, maybe that was the 5th district being Atlanta. Yeah, the 5th. And the 1st district, though, as well as the districts around Atlanta, did see decreases in the amount of jobs, probably because there's a lot of educational services that come out of Atlanta. So there was some moderate job decreases around there. So that is the basics for Georgia and the U.S. Export data from our report. Now I'd like to invite our colleague David Thomas to participate with me in the Q&A. So I will introduce him really quickly, and then we will have our moderator come up as well. And first I'll introduce David. David Thomas is Senior Vice President at the U.S.-China Business Council. He is responsible for the management of the Council's Washington, D.C. office. And he has 2 decades of experience advising and advocating for business across a range of sectors on international policy matters, including as a trade association professional, outside counsel and lobbyist, and also a congressional trade committee staffer. Before his tenure at USCBC, he served as senior counsel of global policy and international trade at the Entertainment Software Association, and was also previously a vice president of trade policy at the Business Roundtable. So thank you, David, for joining us. And I'd also like to invite up our moderator, who will join me up here in one of these chairs, Jim Hoadley, Associate Director of the Georgia Tech Center for International Business Education and Research. And I'm sorry, I realized I didn't get your bio.
Oh, that's fine, that's fine.
So now we will, let me exit out of this screen share. And if you want to go ahead and have a seat. Okay. All right. I think that is it.
All right. First question, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I think you need to take yourself off mute. Perhaps. I hope.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Good. I feel like it's an old Verizon question. Anyway, from the list of questions that I have, and also, is there a way that we can get questions from the audience, or?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure how we're getting questions from the chat. They'll be fed to us.
I'll read the chat if we receive it.
Okay, I'll kick it off with the first question is, what are the states that export the most in goods and services to China, and how does Georgia rank?
All right. So I will answer that one. And David, just want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So up pretty well in the ranking nationally of states exporting to China. So in services, the top exporters are California and New York. California at 7.4 billion and New York at 4.2 billion. Georgia comes in at 10th, so not super high, but really not bad, at 1.1 billion exports of services to China. Georgia, for goods exports, does even better. It's the 8th largest good exporter to China. So that's 4.2 billion exports of goods, and that's after Texas, who is number 1 at 20.6 billion, and California at 16.5 billion as number 2. So pretty decent turnout.
Okay. No, nothing. Oh, we have from the audience, if you could introduce yourself and speak up, please.
Sure. My name is Catherine John. I have a question about the goods exports. So what's the kind of ballpark breakdown between the government behavior that caused the increase versus the more like the individual hands of market, like the private public companies, supply and demand? Because you mentioned some of these agricultural products exports come from the phase 1 agreement. So just want to know. And also just want to clarify for the service exports, for example, the students come to study in U.S. Colleges. These are actually services provided on the U.S. soil, but for a foreign person, right? Okay.
Correct. Okay. So, David, were you able to hear that question okay?
Partially, but you go ahead, Elizabeth.
Okay. So the question was, how much of the exports can you tie back to government impacts and government involvement as opposed to the involvement of private industry? And she used as an example the phase 1 agreement. So I would say that the phase 1 agreement was correcting some restrictions caused by the government. So if anything, it was bringing things back to the natural level, so to speak, that they would have been without the government involvement. So there were specific purchase agreements that China made to help balance that trade deficit. David, what would you like to add related to that?
Yes, well, first, let me thank Jim and Dalton State for having us. I apologize I couldn't be there in person with Elizabeth, but pleased that technology allows me to join virtually. On that good question, I would add, under the phase 1 deal between the U.S. and Chinese governments a couple of years ago, the agriculture sector in the U.S. and the financial services sectors in the U.S., I think, were the largest beneficiaries in terms of, to Elizabeth's point, reestablishing some ground and then building on that. But for many other sectors, China did not fully meet its commitments under that. The Chinese government has cited changed, quote unquote, market conditions, primarily citing the pandemic, right, and the impact that's had on trade globally and between our two countries. And my last point would be, so much, right, of the trade, the commerce, the investment between any two countries like the U.S. and China is driven by private companies, right? By private I mean private sector companies, whether publicly traded or privately held, and often those companies wanting governments to not put in place restrictions that can harm or cut back on such trade or commerce. So I'm sure Jim will have questions on this, but the U.S. tariffs on imports from China over the last couple of years are an example that has reduced some trade.
Thank you for your question. Do you have any in the chat room?
no, not from online, but there was a comment that we probably want to repeat. Elizabeth might want to repeat the audience question because that's harder to hear for the online.
Sure. All right, moving on to the list. In the presentation that you gave, you highlighted the particular industries that were of importance to Georgia's exports to China. Which particular industries does Georgia excel relative to its to other states and exports to China?
Sure. The primary one at the top would be paper and pulp products. Georgia is the largest U.S. state exporting paper and pulp and paperboard mill products to China. Some of the largest paper products companies are headquartered in Atlanta, so that's a big reason. Georgia is the third largest exporter of motor vehicles to China. And like I said before, that number has really skyrocketed in the past 3 years. Georgia is the seventh largest exporter of meat products. And I know the flooring industry is strong in Dalton. Unfortunately, the way that the data works is we sort industries by the NAICS code, and there's different codes for different types of flooring, and so we're not able to produce a number for that one. So sorry about that, but Georgia is actually pretty strong in several different industries.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? I was curious that motor vehicles were so high. The main plant that I'm aware of right now that is currently manufacturing is the Kia plant in West Point, Georgia, although I think there might be an additional, like a panel truck manufacturing as well. But we don't have a whole lot of motor vehicle manufacturing. Do you know specifically which factories those are coming out of?
That's the one that I'm aware of too. I think this specifically refers to entire vehicles, if I'm not mistaken, not just parts. So I'm not sure, but I can. If anyone else in the audience or online knows.
Well, so even though if the company is, say, German company, but they are in Georgia, such as Porsche, that would be counted as exporting from Georgia, right?
So Lulu with Tennessee China Network said that even if it's a German company exporting, such as Porsche, going to China, that would still count. And I believe that is true. But
I think John
Petrina from Georgia Ports Authority is online, and he'll share us some input here, I think.
Thank you for allowing me the opportunity. In addition to the Kia plant, just across the border in Alabama is a Mercedes-Benz plant in Vance, Alabama. And we have rail connections directly into the Port of Savannah and also the Port of Brunswick, where we export the SUVs that are made in Vance all over the world. So while, again, it may not be made in Georgia, it's being exported through Georgia. And so you had a lot of automobiles on the one slide, and you also had ocean freight and transportation on one of the slides as far as service goes. And well, I wasn't necessarily connecting the two earlier on during your presentation. A light bulb went off and said, look, if we're moving a lot of those export vehicles through the Port of Brunswick, for example, or the Port of Savannah, those would certainly contribute to those service figures that you're looking at. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
Sure.
very much.
You reminded me of something. One interesting thing about this report is that we actually look at exports from the origin destination, not the transit. So if you look at the Customs Bureau data that they publish, sometimes states will come to us and say, wait, your numbers don't match our numbers. We're looking at customs, but customs tracks it through the port. So if, for example, agriculture exports from the Midwest get undercounted for those states because a lot of their exports get counted at the port. And so our data is a little bit different in that sense because we curate it to take account those kind of issues.
Every time we talk about exports, I learn something new, and I actually teach about it. So that's, I appreciate that. Do we have another question from the audience or from? Oh, okay. Well, we've kind of talked about the next one about how did ocean freight and port services. Well, how since we have our great representative here from the Georgia ports, how does Georgia's freight and port services compare to other states and major ports?
Yeah, so Georgia, and this surprised me, Georgia is number 2 for ocean, the ocean freight and port services to China. So California is number 1 by far, 687 million. And Georgia comes in at number 2 with 112 million. After Georgia is Washington, pretty close, and New Jersey, pretty close behind. So pretty impressive. Do you have any other thoughts on that, John?
I would say that most of our metrics are based in either containers volume or tonnage volumes, not necessarily in dollar value. But I will tell you that out of all the states in the U.S., in April, we ranked as the #1 state for export containers in the nation, which is the first time in our history that ever came up. And we actually read about it. We didn't recognize it immediately. It was like, as we looked at it, it made a lot of sense. And certainly, as you've shown earlier in the slide, China is right there behind Canada. But in terms of container volumes, China would be ahead of Canada, actually. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
Moving on. Next question. How did motor vehicle exports from Georgia compare to other strong automotive exporting states?
All right. I think I left my notes somewhere else on that one. I think I said that already.
You kind of explained most of that already.
It was South Carolina, and let's skip that one for now because I can't remember where I put my notes.
Okay. Some that are a little bit more in depth. The Biden administration has been slow to roll back the trade sanctions on China imposed during the Trump administration. What is the best course of action going forward for small and medium-sized enterprises which rely on imports from China?
Take this one.
Sure, and I heard that question loud and clear, Jim. Thank you. A couple of thoughts for small, medium-sized enterprises and just companies generally that are local to that area. One, if you have any U.S. imports from China that are covered by the U.S. Section 301 tariffs that I referenced earlier, then you should really consider filing public comments with the U.S. Trade Reps Office. They have published in the Federal Register a request for public comments it's going to be a 2-part process. Currently, they're just looking to hear from U.S. companies and stakeholders that want to make the case for continuing the tariffs. If the case is made to continue any particular tariffs, then there'll be a second part to this public comment process, which would be relevant to a U.S. company impacted by such tariffs. We think that second stage would come later in the summer or maybe after that. And that would be an opportunity for, again, U.S. companies impacted by tariffs to make the case for how they're harming the United States, jobs at your companies, manufacturing, other economic activities in the United States. So that's one thought. A second related to that, if you're a U.S. company, if you haven't already, educating your U.S. members of Congress, so your 2 U.S. senators from Georgia and your relevant U.S. House member from your congressional district in Georgia about your company and how it's been impacted by these U.S. Section 301 tariffs. Because there are many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, that have written multiple letters with their colleagues in Congress to the Biden administration, urging that it have a more robust process for reviewing the existing tariffs and granting exclusions to them so that the tariffs would not cover their products. There were much broader exclusions in effect during the Trump administration that are currently in effect now. And the third point I'd make, Jim, is that particularly for your small and medium-sized enterprises that are joining us today, in my experience as a former staffer in the U.S. Congress, the members of Congress I worked for always appreciate not just the data like we're going through today, but also the stories, the anecdotes from companies. Bring it to life for your members of Congress, and particularly from small and medium-sized enterprises, local companies, I think are especially important constituents to members of Congress. I guess the two final points, there, and Elizabeth just referenced this earlier, under our customs laws, we have the harmonized tariff schedule, which is how we classify products to then determine if they're subject to tariffs. And, there are many law firms and consultants that specialize in working with companies on how their imported products should be classified. And so, if a company hasn't taken a look at how you're classified, working with outside legal counsel to see if there are other legal ways to classify your products under the harmonized tariff schedule that might not be subject to the Section 301 tariffs, or even thinking about how you manufacture those products that are subject to the tariffs. And are there any changes in your manufacturing process that might lead to reclassifying the product to a category that's not subject to the tariffs? And my last thought, which we hear from many of our member companies, which are of all sizes, is there's still many of them doing a significant amount of business in or with China, the market, but they also are involved in other markets, and they've been over the last several years, given all the uncertainty between the U.S. and Chinese governments, looking at ways to diversify their supply chains. By that, I don't mean completely moving out of China, but I mean not putting all their eggs in one basket. In addition to being in China, looking at other markets to manufacture, do other activity as well to add to what they do in China and diversify their businesses.
Thank you. I wanted to follow on with a question that I feel that kind of leads into a little bit more. The tariffs against China have been somewhat overshadowed in terms of impact by currently China's zero COVID measures. So what would be the best strategic move that America could make with regard to the continuation of tariffs as COVID subsides in China?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It's another good practical question. Well, I would separate, right, the COVID and the pandemic, the spread of COVID in Hong Kong and China, and the Chinese government's zero COVID policy. I would separate that from the tariffs. There's, I think, understandably been a lot of attention and importance placed on helping the people, the families, the businesses in China, as well as in the U.S., right, get through the ongoing pandemic, managing public health, mental health, et cetera. We're working very closely with our companies on that. In terms of the tariffs, though, back again, what we've been urging the Biden administration and Congress is that these ongoing Section 301 tariffs continue to overwhelmingly harm the United States and U.S. companies of all sizes, much more than China, right? It's been widely reported by many news outlets that, and many companies have spoken up, through newspaper articles, television, radio interviews about how, the costs of the U.S. tariffs are borne by the U.S. companies that import the products covered by these U.S. tariffs. They are not borne by the Chinese government, nor any Chinese companies in China that might supply the U.S. import of the U.S. company. And for example, Moody's has found that American U.S. importers pay over 90% of the costs of the U.S. Tariffs that I'm talking about. So with that, I think to your question, Jim, on the best strategic move that the U.S. government could take, what we at USCBC have been arguing is that USTR, not just do this current public comment process I mentioned, reviewing the existing tariffs and whether they should continue, but that the U.S. Trade Rep's office also undertake a much broader tariff exclusion process. The tariffs that the Biden administration granted earlier this year are just a portion of the many exclusions that the Trump administration had granted. And so we've been urging the Biden administration to reinstate all the Trump-era tariff exclusions that expired at the end of 2020, and to consider going further with additional tariff exclusions. And lastly, I don't think it's politically realistic at this time, but we continue to make the case for why the U.S. tariffs are a form of self-harm, that they've harmed U.S. companies and much more than Chinese. And we continue to argue that the tariffs should be outright removed. But I don't think that's politically realistic at the current moment.
But I have one. Since John is here, end of last year, we keep seeing a lot of the news about the jam at the ports, mostly California. So what's the status now? And some of the imports. This is the import question.
The question for online folks was that we had seen a lot of backups in ports in recent months, and what is the status right now for that supply chain model in the ports? And she had asked, maybe John might like to answer that one.
Sure.
Very panelist here.
The supply chain problems continue to exist. The ships at anchor waiting to come in, it's kind of a moving target. A couple weeks ago in Savannah, we had no ships waiting, and today we've got over 10 ships waiting. And out in California, it depends on what you use as their metrics, but they will tell you they have no ships or a dozen ships waiting, and they really have about 70 plus ships waiting. It depends on how you define waiting. If they're drifting off the coast of Mexico, or if they're slow steaming from China to LA or Long Beach. But the supply chain issues are not fixed. New York, New Jersey, the ports up there continue to have delays as well with ships waiting to get in. And I think it's going to continue that way for a while. I think we heard on the news last week from the major retailers that they were having big supply chain issues. We watched the two biggest U.S. retailers report their results for the quarter, and they imported way more cargo and merchandise than they needed, and they have no place to put it. So we watched the stocks of the two major retailers drop precipitously last week. So we're not out of the woods. We're not in the normal peak shipping season yet. It may not be on the headlines right now, but the bottlenecks do continue to exist, both on the West Coast ports and on the East Coast ports.
Thank you. Elizabeth indicated to me that there's a question in the audience that I missed.
I was just curious about the tariffs are punitive and what industries were the focus of the tariffs and why.
Did everyone hear that, or do we need to repeat?
I think so. What industries are the subject to the U.S. tariffs and why? Is that correct? Yeah. Thank you for the question. So this goes back several years during the Trump administration. They started what is called a Section 301 investigation. Section 301 is a section of U.S. law looking at these investigations typically take a half year to a year. And then they report findings, U.S. Trade Rep does this, on, in this case, Chinese government policies that unfairly treat U.S. companies. And this resulted in the Trump administration, after these findings of such unfair trade practices, imposing the Section 301 tariffs that are still in effect to this day, but being reviewed by the Biden administration 4 years later. And in terms of the industries, again, the focus was on Chinese subsidies and other industrial policies that were alleged to unfairly benefit Chinese companies at the expense of U.S. companies. So it was a range of industries in terms of technology industries, manufacturing, some consumer-facing products. Obviously, in the current environment in the U.S. with inflation up, interest rates up, these tariffs have had an additional impact. And I do know the Biden administration is particularly looking at the tariffs on consumer-facing products and companies, given those inflationary pressures. The last point I would make is the Biden administration has also been rumored to be considering starting its own additional Section 301 investigation to focus even more in on Chinese industrial policies. And if that leads to positive findings, it could lead to the existing tariffs being shifted to focus on Chinese industries and companies even more that have benefited from Chinese subsidies and other industrial policies, such as under the China 2025 plan.
Thank you. We're in the last 4 minutes, so if anybody has questions, please ask them now. Yes.
So looking at this year, because China's zero COVID policy, I can imagine the U.S. import from China will be hurt a lot, as well as U.S. service exports. But how about U.S. goods exports? Looks like for the, I know it's hard to predict it for the full year, but just kind of an estimate.
First, did everybody hear that? Or do we need to repeat it?
Was the question on U.S. food, agriculture exports?
The question was that COVID,
for this year, yeah.
COVID will be impacting U.S. exports of service to China, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But what do we anticipate the exports will, the import on goods exports to China will be of current COVID policies and the like? Is that pretty close? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth, do you want me to take that, Elizabeth?
Well, she was asking about how it might impact U.S. imports from China,
U.S. exports,
but also exports to China.
Imports kind of going to be hurt a lot because they're not producing, their goods are not coming out. Mm-hmm. But how about U.S. exports to China? Is that impacting a big time or?
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things about Chinese imports being impacted in a negative way by COVID is that a lot of U.S. exports have Chinese inputs in them. And that's something that a lot of people forget when we're talking about trade with China, that a lot of U.S. exporters import products from China and many other countries and then assemble them into their final products here. So when you have supply chain problems where you can't get some of your parts from any one country, it can really impact your ability to export. So that's one piece of it. But another piece is whether the Chinese consumers and businesses are still going to be buying, considering many of them might be in lockdown or that their economy might be negatively impacted going forward on with COVID. So we tend to try not to predict the future because that can be pretty dicey. There's so many different things that could possibly happen, especially in this political year where we've got midterm elections here and China has the National People's Congress in the fall. A lot could happen between now and then. David, do you think that you have anything else to add about how COVID and the lockdowns in China might impact U.S. exports to China?
I would just make 2 points. On the services side, if I heard the question, I think the person in the room already noted that services exports would presumably still be impacted given the travel and other restrictions that impact obviously business and pleasure travel, as well as students, right? Chinese students studying in the United States. And then on the goods side, the U.S. government figures I've seen, I think it was definitely for the first month of this year, it may have been the first quarter of 2022, on the goods export side, showed that those were holding steady, if not increasing some, in contrast to the services exports that we've talked about.
Yeah, and as a reminder, in 2021, the goods exports were the highest they've ever been. So hopefully that trend will continue.
Well, I did hear the beautiful chiming of the bells in the clock tower, which indicates that we're probably approaching the end of our event. So I'll turn it back to you, Tono, to close us out.
I was trying to see if Dr. Helm actually joined us virtually, because she said something about doing closing. If not, then we'll close on you again.
That's quite all right, and I'd like to thank everybody and the presenters for putting together such an interesting and contemporary subject here. And I always, the economic vitality of Northwest Georgia when I came here is something that really struck me, and the emphasis on exports and logistics is really great, and that it's tied to China. I'm just very impressed with all of that. And thank everybody for coming and participating. I see that there looks like refreshments in the back.
Yes, we will end the virtual portion of this program, that in-person people, we can socialize and network. Thank you.